For a game ostensibly about slaughtering hundreds of everyone's favorite targets you don't have to feel bad about shooting, Wolfenstein: The New Colossus does not want to do the easy thing. Like, in order to be a crowd-pleasing Nazi shooter, all it had to do was basically be Warhammer 40k Space Marine, but with squishy Nazis instead of squishy orcs. Make BJ Blazkowicz a big, nigh-unkillable machine, the very Ubermensch the Nazis thought that they were giving rise to, and let the player have a grand old time grinding some fascists into paste. Wolfenstein: The New Colossus is not that game. If anything, it feels like Machine Games thinks that approach is too easy, that an unrestrained power fantasy could be cathartic but is ultimately empty. Instead, the game has larger thematic ambitions and is kind of a web of semi-introspective self-contradictions. The New Colossus is comprised almost entirely of contentious dualities that are ever at war with one another, and the game doesn't ever stop to make them work together. The end result is a game that is maybe not successful at examining all of its ideas in depth, but does a decent job to get you to question the simple narratives that surround each of its subject matter. For example, our hero, BJ Blazkowicz, is himself a giant walking contradiction. The game is very interested in BJ's psychology. He is the offspring of a racist white Texan and his Jewish wife, the product of a doomed relationship defined by violence. His mother teaches him to be loving and kind and self-sacrificing. She cares for him after both had been injured by one of her husband's violent outbursts. At some point, she offers him a gift, a wedding ring, in hopes that one day he'll find someone special. It's a blunt metaphor, but it's clear that what BJ inherited from his mother is the hope, compassion, and loyalty that ring represents.
It is an engagement ring. It has been with our family for 8 generations. Can you imagine that, Billy?
But despite being an abusive and terrible father, BJ learns things from his dad too.
You are so goddamn weak.
The one fatherly thing we see him do in the entire game is walk his son down into the basement, promising to help him kill any monsters that might be there wanting to take his mother away. There's no small irony in this, given that Rip himself sells out Sophia to the Nazis, but it also sets up a mirror to the wedding ring.
Here's what we're going to do. You take this.
Wow.
Now, you and I are going down into the basement, and any monsters that show up, we shoot them dead. Right between their eyes. Sometimes the best way to fix a problem is to face it head on. You with me?
Yes, Daddy.
The gift that BJ remembers getting from his father was a gun, inheriting, at least metaphorically, a legacy of violence. If he learned acceptance and empathy and a desire to help the downtrodden from his mother, from his father he learns to apply violence to get what he wants. And while he might not have followed in his father's racist footsteps, it's clear he inherited an ability to view at least one group of people without real compassion. Namely, Nazis.
A lot of things you can do with a hatchet. And a Nazi.
So we have the innate contradiction of BJ Blazkowicz, a half-Jewish man described repeatedly by Nazis as appearing exceptionally Aryan.
Fireman, I recognize your face. Very Aryan face it is too.
A man who fights fascist ideology, but is only able to do so through unrelenting and unrestrained violence and carnage. The result is that BJ is a cold, emotionally distant murder machine that thinks nothing of killing Nazis by the truckload, but is also a quiet, introspective, and almost poetic thinker. He opines about Caroline giving him her wings as a metaphor for the power suit keeping him upright.
Caroline, I released the Eva's hammer, and I'm heading back to our people. I hate to ask, will you stick around so I can keep your wings a little longer?
But at the same time, he can't bring himself to tell his lover Anya that he may have been fatally wounded.
But your suit and the cause is all that keeps me upright. And Anya, her voice, her glory, it buckles me. This is the conclusion I've reached. Whatever happens, she can't know she'll be rearing our babies alone. It's my burden to bear until it's hers.
Despite a beautiful internal monologue, he can only express himself through stoicism and guns. I'd almost say there's an interesting deconstruction of gender dynamics at play here. Blazkowicz is by some measure an overly masculine figure in action, but he gets along better with women than men across the board. He may be friends with Fergus or Wyatt or Super Spesh or Set, but he cares deeply for Anya, has no problem with Grace taking over their operations after Caroline's death, and is absolutely revenant of Carolyn.
I came for you. How you holding up, Caroline?
It sets him up in contrast to General Engel, she a woman obsessed with a toxic hypermasculine culture, versus BJ's embrace of not just women, but of strength outside of masculine ideals. This is prodded a bit in his first conversation with Grace.
For a little I spoke with Caroline, she seemed like a hell of a woman.
She had balls of steel.
Balls. Why is it that balls are always used as some fucking default definition of badassery? Small, little, delicate things, resting all snug and warm and cozy and comfortable in their little wrinkly wrapper of fucking skin. Shit.
I don't know if it's a strong through line through the whole game, but this idea that BJ's masculine stoicism and his empathy and willingness to expose himself are in conflict are definitely something examined in the first act. Ultimately, he's both of his parents' children, as violent as he is caring, as callous as he is vulnerable. And it's not just his origins that make BJ a weird contradiction, there's the state of his physical body. At the end of the New Order, BJ is seemingly fatally wounded. In the opening scenes of the new Colossus, it is revealed that he was able to be extracted and saved, but only after extensive surgery, the removal of most of his intestines, and the onset of renal failure that his team really couldn't fix. The result is that BJ, like Carolyn, is confined to a wheelchair during the opening of the game, and not long for this world. Eventually, he gets the Dot Ya Should power suit from the previous game, giving him the ability to walk again, but his health is capped at half. It's a constant reminder of BJ's mortality, and while it's sometimes frustrating to die because of this, it's a constant reminder that he is at once a superhuman warrior and a vulnerable, slowly dying man. Much like the gender dynamics, it's a subversion of the archetype you would expect the game to lean into, the unkillable, muscle-bound superhero. Instead, it leans into BJ's weakness, his humanity. Then, halfway through the game, BJ dies. Or more specifically, his head is forcibly removed from his body, but it's okay because his friends get his head and put it on a new robot body. Now BJ isn't dying, he's both alive and dead, and he isn't a weak man propped up by machines, but he is both man and machine. BJ's health is back up to 100, and now he has special movement powers. The boundaries between his hard external shell and soft dying innards have been erased, and he is now, in some sense, whole. And it happens shortly after telling Anya the truth about his condition and trying to get the wedding ring to commit to her despite knowing that he was dying. Get it? The metaphor about the hard exterior and the soft insides melding into a cohesive whole when he finally lets his guard down and commits to vulnerability? That he's no longer a soft man dying inside of a hard exterior, but is a unified person again? It's a goofy, pulpy metamorphosis, but it makes a certain amount of absurd sense, a transformation to reflect his character growth. The first time in the game we see BJ seemingly comfortable in his body is when he's not in his body. It took externalizing his fear of not being there for Anya and coming to terms with his weakness and mortality to make him stronger. This also plays into bigger themes of criticizing Nazi ideology. It isn't power that made BJ stronger, but empathy and weakness.
The old and the weak are doomed.
All of this is also in service of deconstructing BJ Blazkowicz as a video game protagonist. It wants to understand his motivations, and it wants to flesh out how a character like this would work if they exist. On one hand, it's kind of dopey. It's kind of the opposite of Doom, where that game tossed self-seriousness out the window given the absurdity of its setup. The new Colossus embraces it. On the other hand, it's clear this game is more character-motivated than plot-motivated, which makes sense. It is supposedly the middle chapter of this proposed New Order trilogy, and it focuses less on plot, which is pretty structureless and mostly consists of doing errands to stoke American fervor before finally taking out an obligatory big bad in the finale, and instead centers on character work pretty much across the board. There is a bunch of wonderful character-driven segments throughout this game, not just about BJ, and spending time with these sharply written characters is genuinely a joy.
Nexus! Nexus! Come on, give him a punch! Nexus! Nexus! A smear! Give him a smear!
And in that context, as silly as it is to get an in-depth exploration of the physicality and psychology of a half-human, half-robot, half-dead, half-alive, half-Jewish, half-racist white Texan who murders thousands of Nazis, it works for what the game's going for. Other dualities and contradictions don't fare quite as well. Take, for example, the tone. The game's predecessor, Wolfenstein: The New Order, had its share of tone issues as well. That game showed the horrors of Nazi Germany as an excuse for what was otherwise a grindhouse revenge plot. It used Nazi ideology as a means to drive its antagonists to do unspeakably evil things in order to justify a bloody, indulgent fracas on the other end. Basically, the game went back and forth between BJ lamenting the horrors of war and the atrocity he's seen in his days of fighting this horrible enemy and the enormous human cost.
Troop transport. More dead kids. Seen this too many times.
and the indulgent fantasy of shooting, stabbing, and blowing up pretty much anyone that was involved in those crimes, up to and including robot dogs and Nazis on the moon. I guess what I'm saying is that going from labor camp where they take away a baby to Moonraker but with Nazis gives you a bit of tonal whiplash, like swinging wildly back and forth between Indiana Jones or the end of Inglourious Bastards and a sort of Saving Private Ryan meets Life is Beautiful lamentation on the conflict and loss caused by the Nazis.
I made the wrong choice.
You made a stupid choice! Yes, you did! You left a boy in charge of a man's work. I should have died on that day, Captain, on that slab, and Fergus Reed should have lived.
Petkovich, can you hear me? What's your status?
Well, I'm on the motherfucking moon.
The mouse on this one. I will clean it out with soap.
The game seemed at all times to be both affecting and manipulative, earnest and overly indulgent. The result was that the New Order could make its audience uncomfortable. Is this game set in an alternate history where the Nazis won to tell a story of hope winning against all odds, or is it just infatuated with the look of Nazi aesthetics and brutalism? Is this game taking us to a labor camp so that we can understand the horrors of the Holocaust, or because it wanted to mix things up with a stealth section? The New Order didn't want to sugarcoat Nazi horrors, which seems appropriate given the material it's dealing with, but it did so in order to justify an over-the-top grindhouse shooter, and that never really felt quite right. So the new Colossus tries to fix this tonal whiplash by upping the pulp and throwing in some jokes, and the result is weird. It's less affecting than the first game, there's not as much raw emotional earnestness, but it's just as awkward because the jokes and exaggerated pulp still clash tonally with the sincere bits.
William? Don't know if this is normal, but I think the pregnancy is making me a little, you know, excited. Oh God, is everyone listening in on this frequency? Yes.
Yes. Max sauce.
So instead of depictions of Nazi horrors bumping up against gritty revenge porn and making you uncomfortable about the way the game feels about its own violence, the new Colossus pits visual gags and poop jokes up against the struggle to start a revolution or to worry about one's loved ones in a time of war. It's less actively uncomfortable than the first game's condemnation of Nazi violence and disregard for its own, but it has a bizarre surreality all of its own. For example, here's the setup. After saving Grace and Super Spesh from the top of the Empire State Building, Spesh discovers the U-boat's toilet.
Is this a working toilet I see before me? Handle toward my hand?
Yes. Yes, this toilet can handle all sorts of waste. Feces, urine, vomitus, you name it.
Do you have asswipe?
If by that you mean toilet paper, yes. Yes, of course we need to mind our rations a little bit, but there's asswipe in there.
God, oh my God,
yes.
Oh my sweet God in heaven, a working, mother-flushing toilet. I never thought I'd see the day.
Then we go on a mission where BJ contemplates his pending mortality, having been critically wounded in the last game, and how he can't possibly let his pregnant partner Anya know about it.
Whatever happens, she can't know she'll be rearing our babies alone. It's my burden to bear until it's hers.
When that mission is over, BJ has a conversation with Anya and he slips, telling her, and, well...
Because I'm fucking dying. And the longer we keep pretending it won't happen, the harder it's gonna be. I'll be in the ground a week from now.
You don't know that! What, you can see the future now? Don't act like you know things you can't possibly know!
The toilet works.
Like, that's weird, right? It's weird to set up and then pay off a poop joke in the middle of a scene like that. It pays off in a tender moment immediately after as an image of love that BJ and Anya can aspire to, but the game is loaded with these little jokes, whether it's Wyatt dropping LSD when trying to liberate New Orleans, Fergus not being able to control his robot arm, or Bombate warning you about alligators in the New York sewers.
Hey, big friend, you better watch out for the crocodiles.
Crocodiles?
It's not New York underground crawling with crocodiles.
Oh no, I'm from Texas.
The game has a much more comedic bent than the first one, but I'm not sure it fixes the tone problems. The game still oscillates in tone by the same amount, but instead of going from horrors of war to grindhouse, we get contemplating fatherhood abuse to poop jokes. It's weird. I don't know if it's good or bad, it's just most games aren't tonally this weird. Also awkward and self-contradictory is the gameplay. The New Order felt like it was sort of a relic from the recent past, a Half-Life 2 style shooter from the mid-2000s that somehow managed to find itself released in 2014. It had a mix of gameplay styles, from stealth segments to run-and-gun bits to platforming to story-driven stuff to various vehicle sections, with the signature set pieces being levels where you had an option to take out officers, either stealthily without alerting anybody, or guns a-blazing depending on your play preference. While the new Colossus keeps up with a lot of that, the emphasis is now pretty squarely on the hunting down the officers thing, but with changes that seem to make both the stealth and run-and-gun combat a little frustrating. Where the levels in the New Order guide players from enemy to enemy to make stealth somewhat telegraphed because they were stealth sections in an action game trying to just keep its gameplay varied, in the new Colossus players fend for themselves in a maze of confusing catacombs where it's easy to get spotted by turning a blind corner or not having a clear indication of enemy visibility cones when crossing an open room. Worse, as soon as you're spotted, all of the alarms trip. This was not the case in the New Order, where you had a fraction of a second to kill an officer or shoot a soldier with a silenced pistol before they fired their guns and alarms were tripped. Worse, the game has a terrible sense of when to autosave, and I've had it autosave at the beginning of an officer hunting section, having fired a single shot in the previous room, so that by the time the autosave happened, all the officers were already aware of me, making stealth kind of a non-thing for that section. So stealth isn't as viable as it used to be, but it's made far more important by focusing on these officer hunting missions. On the flip side, because BJ's health is capped at 50 for the first half of the game, and the game communicates that you're taking damage really poorly, and because the game's difficulty settings seem to just up enemy accuracy and damage rates, BJ feels like a glass cannon. It never quite feels like the action sequences can reach the all-out bravado that dual-wielding shotguns and a suit of power armor would suggest they can. Instead, it felt like cheesing Nightfall missions in Destiny 1, holing up having found myself with 20 health and taking potshots from cover. At its most run and gun, when you're over 100 health, you can burst out, fire wildly, then retreat into a room and spam E, hoping to pick up a health pack and recover whatever health you lost in your foolish little stunt. It doesn't exactly have the kinetic flow of Doom, is I guess what I'm saying. Also not helping things is the fact that once the alarms are tripped, you can't go back into stealth mode for that section, so the game modes feel really modal and disparate. It isn't a stealth action game like Metal Gear Solid or Hitman that flow back and forth between stealth and action sequences. It's a clunky stealth game that becomes a run-and-gun shooter that hates run-and-gun protagonists as soon as you fail any stealth check. And I think I get what they were going for. A Die Hard style approach where cunning and stealth work until they don't, and then it's an all-out awesome scrappy action movie fight. A nod to both the original top-down DOS game's Stealth and the Wolf 3D's Incarnation's Carnage. In practice, I don't think either mode quite works. The stealth is too easily failed, and BJ is too fragile in combat even at full health and armor. Even the fancy robot movement techniques in the second half of the game don't seem to benefit either mode tremendously. They mostly just let you take various shortcuts. It's a stealth game and it's an action game, but it's also not really either, as it has the mechanics for both but a solid implementation of neither. Finally, let's look at the big self-contradiction-y theme we've kind of been avoiding until now, the way the new Colossus presents the United States itself. This game, which, reminder, was developed by Swedish studio Machine Games, has decidedly mixed feelings about Americana. There were bits of this already present in the original The New Order, of course. There's a newspaper clipping about the Nazis dropping the atom bomb on Manhattan that parallels arguments made by Americans that by dropping the bomb they actually saved millions of lives by preventing a ground war. And then there's this conversation BJ can have with Jay.
They would throw me in the gas chamber just like they did all the others.
None of that has anything to do with me. That's not the America I fought for.
Really? I was little. My mother wanted to take me to the picture show, but we had to go in through the fucking colored entrance. I wanted a hot dog and a lemonade, but the sign says we don't serve Negroes in this establishment. Before all this, before the Germans, before the war, back home, man, you were the Nazis.
Be careful what you call me.
But for the most part, the New Order was focused on telling its grindhouse revenge plot. The new Colossus brings this criticism in comparison to America to the forefront and uses those self-contradictions to do so. On one hand, the game is interested in how easy it would have been for Americans, white, straight, Christian Americans specifically, to roll over to Nazi rule. You can actually see this change in tone between the games. In The New Order, where the emphasis is on Nazi aesthetics and hypocrisy, there's a defeatist tone about how all-powerful and all-reaching the Reich is, and that those who would have fought back slowly had their wills crushed after 14 years of Nazi rule. In the new Colossus, that script is kind of flipped. The focus is now on how once the American government surrendered, there was no real resistance in the States, that Americans were more concerned about saving their own status than standing up for what was right, that it was easier to acquiesce to a foreign power that emboldened those already comfortable than continue fighting for those on the outskirts of society. BJ's father, Rip, manages to get himself a ranch as a reward for selling out local townsfolk to the Reich, including his wife. Little old ladies chat casually about owning slaves.
Give my regards to your father when you return to the farm. Oh, and tell him I'm putting some hardworking slaves up for auction this week if he's interested. There'll be cocktails.
I'll tell him, Auntie. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye, dear.
America's own homegrown racists and the KKK decide to wear their hoods around town casually and start taking orders from Nazis like they're some sort of fan club or toadies. The Wolfenstein franchise has always hated Nazis, but with the new Colossus it finds time to hold in contempt those who may not be Nazis themselves, but would do nothing to stop them so long as they kept their current social status. There are also some jabs at America's past that make use of the alternate timeline gimmick. Seeing a Disneyland-style Main Street USA scene decorated with swastikas and Nazi paraphernalia is a pretty effective way to shatter the idealism of small-town Americana in the 60s, and while hyperbolic, it's a reminder of the hidden grotesqueries we sugarcoat over with these Norman Rockwell images, given the reality of what life was like back then for some of the people the Nazis targeted. It might be shocking imagery to white folk who look back fondly on that era and hate the Nazis and don't consider themselves racists, but it's probably less shocking to people who remember living through that era's Jim Crow laws. Relatedly, Grace's Black Revolutionary Front started in response to Nazi oppression, but it's easy to draw lines between that and the actual civil rights movements of our 60s. Systemic oppression is a core tenet of Nazi ideology, but it was also a core tenet of American discourse only 50 or so years ago, and really through to this day. The game even brings back the bombing of Manhattan, this time as a terrifying story told by Grace to BJ.
And I remember this mother and son. This boy was blindly stumbling through the chaos. His arms were outstretched, calling out for his mama. And the heat from the bomb had melted the skin on his arms, and they just drooped. Like he was wearing a shirt that was a couple of sizes too big. And I remember his mama. She was crawling to get to him, and the half of her body was all gone. It was just gone. What are you thinking in a moment like that?
The comparison between the bombing of Japan and the bombing of Manhattan is unspoken this time, but it's impossible to separate the two. The shock, terror, and sorrow described by Grace really happened, and America were the ones responsible for unleashing that horror. The point is, the game shows or describes monstrous Nazi acts as a clear criticism of America's own problems with race and violence. It's not America equals Nazis, but instead it tries to use the alt-history angle to suggest that while America isn't Nazis, how close have they come and how often? How do we so easily treat Nazis as first-person shooter fodder without judging our own monstrous past? On the other hand, the game also seems to believe in the ideals America purports to stand for. The game's subtitle, The New Colossus, references the famous poem by Jewish poet Emma Lazarus that is inseparably associated with the Statue of Liberty. You know, where the lines, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free," came from. And that's what BJ's Rebellion dedicate themselves to doing for most of the game, rescuing the Black Revolutionary Front from New York, those confined to the super ghettos of Nazi-run New Orleans, and even accepting turncoat Nazis.
Can I be of use?
What do we know, Lars? Tanya?
Ava's Hammer becomes a home to all those put out by the Reich, and as the game goes on, it becomes more and more populated by those you've welcomed. Given that the game shows the destroyed Statue of Liberty multiple times with little to no comment, the reference to the new Colossus poem almost stops being about the statue and becomes a metaphor for the rebellion itself. Speaking of the rebellion, Caroline's whole plan hinged on awakening the freedom fighter in America first and using that as the launchpad to resume the war. And that's an ideal that BJ never gave up on. That Americans just need to see that the fight isn't over, that their freedoms are being trampled on, and that the only recourse is to fight back.
But I know this. You take freedom away from the American people, you're playing with fire. And I intend to pour some gasoline. People gotta know they don't have to take this shit no more. And if nothing else, that's what I'm gonna do. before I go.
See, that's what I'm talking about, Blazkowicz!
The whole game treats this idea that America is an evergreen well of freedom that just needs to be tapped appropriately dead seriously. It isn't done with irony or sarcasm or Nazi references that make it maybe kind of morally gray. It's treated as fact. Just as the game criticizes American history and actions, it lionizes American potential and ideals and beliefs. In this way, the new Colossus presents America again as a complicated, conflicted entity. In effect, it frames BJ and America along very similar lines, entities born from both idealism and violence, torn between elegant dialogue about equality and justice and an inability to escape from their bloody and abusive histories, the product of as much love and compassion as racism and self-interest. And because of that, I don't really think that the much talked about attempts to lean into the current political discourse really work for this game. It's not that they're not appreciated, but the framing of the game doesn't really work with the cute winks and nods to the past 2 or so years, which mostly happen in incidental dialogue and barks or newspaper clippings in the environment. The bulk of Wolfenstein II is a reminder that America has its own trouble with race and violence, and that the simple narratives we tell ourselves about Nazis being a one-and-done threat from the 40s simply aren't true, but also that the American ideals of freedom and equality are a thankful bulwark against such terrors. And that may have felt true when development started on this project, but it rings kind of hollow in the divided political climate of 2017. America doesn't feel like it's this melting pot combination of terrible and goodness, of light and dark, of good and evil. More than anything now, it feels like it's being torn between these two identities, like they're at this point fundamentally incompatible. While Wolfenstein II frames America as a freedom lover's problematic fave, that rings increasingly hollow and alien with each passing day here in the real world. It's also why I think I was ultimately disappointed when the game wasn't the big, dumb, lazy shooter it could have been. The new Colossus is too fantastical with its alternate history setting and too absurd with its grindhouse violence to really sell a deep treatise on the origins and spread of Nazi ideology and how readily American minds might cotton to it and how the roots of American racism and fascism have always been here. I mean, this is a game with a scene like this. But it's also too self-serious to give us a real sense of escapism from the spike in this sort of ideology we see around us these days. In this game, friends die, people have scars emotionally and physically, stories of children dying in front of helpless parents are told, BJ confronts his mortality and his childhood abuser and the fact that his mom's dead. Wolfenstein 3D's Get Psyched doesn't appear as a prelude to a cathartic spat of carnage, but effectively as a teaser for the third game in the trilogy where the revolution is now truly on. Yay, get psyched about sequels. This isn't the breath of fanciful fascism-fighting enthusiasm we probably needed in this moment, even though it could have been. And that's not Wolfenstein 2's fault, really, but that's the environment it finds itself released in. In the end, Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus is interesting. The character work and voice acting is some of the best all year. Honestly, it's some of the best big-budget games writing I've seen since Mafia 3. And the desire to look at its subject matter in more complicated terms than its genre typically lets on is commendable, and if any of the themes and ideas it brings up sound engaging, I'd definitely recommend playing through it. But it's also a first-person shooter where most of the time is spent zooming around and dual-wielding shotguns to turn bad guys into red mist, or hacking Nazis to death with a hatchet in stealth segments, that also wants to talk about something as profound as systemic racism and the rise of a fictional flavor of American fascism. And that story, while definitely well told, was probably mostly written 2 years ago. And at this point, it almost feels like that material is coming from an alternate timeline.